What do you do if you borrow a lens and then you do some testing with that lens and do some shooting in order to make sure that you can produce a lens review video and then you get a corrupted memory card? You produce this video instead. Today we're going to be talking about how to get a Milky Way Galaxy shot and what's the process and what's the gear, what's the math behind it, and what a T-stop is. All of this thrown together at the last minute for you. Let's get started. So as I was saying, I was at a photographic workshop that I was teaching this past weekend in Deer Trail, Colorado, at a place called the Great Escape Mustang Sanctuary. We shot wild Mustang herd during the day, and that night we were doing an astrophotography project, and I wanted to do a lens review during the day of the Tamron 70 to 210 f4, and I was using it in a Nikon mount. And just based off of shooting experience and looking at the back of the camera, I was pleased with it. I was looking forward to producing a lens review video off of that lens. And then when I got home, the whole memory card was corrupted. Now, fortunately, I was shooting with a different camera to do my video work and my astrophotography that night, so I did not lose those images. But it does mean I can't do the lens review video that I was meaning to, so I'm going to be using it again at a future time to get that information, because it was a fun lens to shoot with, and I think that that's going to be a good video. Anyway, I did do astrophotography this past weekend, and I wanted to do a video, and so doing a video on how to do that I think is going to be useful. If you're finding this video by searching how to do Milky Way Galaxy shots, take a look at the other videos I have on lenses and studio shooting and other things. Let's jump right into it. So I was shooting with a 16 to 35 f2.8 lens. Now, I was shooting with a full frame camera, and the basic way that we work when we're shooting with a full frame camera to do astrophotography or we're doing Milky Way Galaxy is we need to think whether or not we want star trails or we want pinpoint stars. Now, if you're doing the Milky Way Galaxy, you of course want pinpoint stars rather than star trails, because you're just going to get motion blur out of the gas clouds and you're going to lose the Milky Way Galaxy itself. So we're not going for motion blur. To be able to achieve pinpoint stars at night, the rule is pretty simple. All right, your shutter speed times your focal length needs to be less than 500. This is called the rule of 500 in the world of astrophotography and night sky photography. There's going to be a little bit of variation to it that we're going to talk about, but generally speaking, if I'm shooting with a full frame camera and I frame up my shot and it's perfect at 50 millimeters, then I can shoot that photograph for no more than 10 seconds. Now, let's talk about the variation in full frame cameras. The more resolution you are shooting with, the more conservative you need to be. So I was shooting with an A7R Mark III 42 million pixel camera. I needed to be well below that 500 marker. For me, I was aiming for really not breaking about 400 if I took my focal length and multiplied my shutter speed. I was hanging around that kind of neighborhood. So I was shooting at 17 millimeter for 10 to 13 seconds. And so I was being very conservative, but I didn't want any motion blur in my shots. So what have we just done? Well, first of all, if you frame your shot, you divide that into 500, and you're going to come up with a shutter speed. Round down on that rather than rounding up, and that can be your top amount of time. At that point, we've determined your aperture and we've determined your shutter speed. The only thing that remains is ISO. So your ISO goes up until you bring out the amount of information, stars and galaxy that you want in the photograph. For me, I was shooting an average of 4,000 to 5,000 ISO, f2.8, for 10 seconds. Some 13-second exposures, but mostly 10. So if you're shooting 2.8, you're still going to need those higher ISOs. What if you don't shoot with a full-frame camera? Then we change the number we divide into. Because remember, the smaller the sensor you shoot with, the smaller or more acute the angle that any given focal length actually views, which means you're more telephoto effectively. Okay? So as a result, if you shoot with an APS-C camera, then realistically you're taking your focal length and dividing it into something between 300 and 320 rather than 500. I've always been conservative and said 300 with that, but dividing into 320 is mathematically totally appropriate. If you shoot with a 4/3 camera, then you're dividing into 250 rather than 320 or 500. And that's going to give you the max shutter speed before you get motion blur from the rotation of Earth. Now, if you want star trails, you just break the rule of 500. How much do you break it by? Well, that answer is basically how long do you want your star trails to be. So those can be shot at much lower ISOs, much easier to do. But if I'm shooting with the goal of pinpoint accuracy and no motion blur, then I really do need as bright of a lens as I can get. And this is why wide-angle bright lenses have become a serious trend, because this type of photography is getting much easier for people to be able to do. This is why things like your 14mm 1.4 lens from Sigma is as popular as it is this is a beautiful astrophotography lens. It does exactly what we just asked for. Wide angle to get the shot, bright aperture in order to be able to get the ISO that we want out of the shot, because our shutter speed is relatively fixed. Now, there's going to be, it's not really a variation in technique, but there is something else that we need to consider when we're doing this type of astrophotography, and that is T-stops. A lot of people don't know what they are because they don't generally affect your photography too much unless you're doing video or astrophotography. I think it's useful to know about them anyway, but those are the two times they become really important. And here's the easiest difference. An f-stop is a mathematical calculation of how much light should be passing through the lens. A t-stop is an actual measurement of the light that leaves the lens, thus is transmitted, that's the t in t-stop, onto the sensor. Let me give you an example of how this works, or at least an analogy to start with. When you type into Google Maps the directions to get to an address you haven't been to before, no one actually drove that route to see how much time it would take. It's mathematically calculated. It might be off by a little bit. That can happen based on traffic. If someone was to drive the route and report back to you the exact amount of time it takes, that would be a t-stop. So f-stops being mathematically calculated, we can label right on a lens. A t-stop, someone needs to measure. And this is why you get t-stop recordings on some lenses and you don't get that information as easily on others. However, it does make a difference. Pardon me. If I'm trying to gather as much light on the sensor as possible for astrophotography, I need the best t-stop possible. Now, I did look it up just so I would know. I was shooting with the G Master Sony 16-35 2.8. So the f 2.8 is the mathematical calculation of the aperture size. The transmission value is always given as something that's similar to an aperture in its numbering system and will always be the same as or dimmer than the f-stop. It can't ever gain brightness as light leaves the aperture and goes onto the sensor. The t-stop value on the 16-35 is 2.9, which is an exceptional number. A lot of lenses are a third to two-thirds of a stop dimmer in their transmission value rather than their f-stop. There's this incredibly small light loss off of that lens, which is why it's such a prized lens. I was examining some, since this was a workshop, we were giving out to everybody, here's what our exposure values are. And we were getting different exposures on the screen from different people. Why? Different lenses will have different t-stop values. So knowing the t-stop value of your particular lens makes a difference. And knowing whether the transmission value of one lens you're looking at for night photography really is going to help you or hinder you in your shooting. Anyway, I hope that was helpful in how to get a nice Milky Way Galaxy shot. Know how to set the exposure in manual. Go to manual focus. I like to spin all the way to infinity and pull back by a little bit for the focusing. That's worked well for me. What should your white balance be? We were manually setting Kelvin at 3800, and I did have to adjust that a little bit in post to get the color I really wanted out of it. But it does give you a good starting point. Some people just choose fluorescent and get reasonably close. But either way, I find that you're going to have to adjust these in post-production. Of course, always shoot them in RAW as you should shoot every photograph, because you're going to need to be able to pull information out later on. That's how you do a Milky Way Galaxy shot. Sorry that it wasn't a lens review. That's what I was planning on being able to produce, and there will be several more of those coming up, including a lens comparison with 35mm prime. So don't forget that or miss that. And if you want to make sure that you don't miss it, hit the subscribe button. It's free. You knew that. Give us a like, give us a comment, jump in there and talk about what other types of shots you might want me to examine and tell you how I teach people to do them. I'd love to help you out. And thanks to everybody who has been commenting on the videos. It's making it a nice forum, which is fantastic. Have a wonderful day, and I'll see you next time. Bye.